Please subscribe to my channel so you never miss out on any incredible real-life stories. Today, I want to share a remarkable tale that happened in a small American city. It's about a man named James who led a quiet, unassuming life until one fateful night. He discovered an abandoned infant lying helpless in a dark alley. What followed set off a chain of events that would circle back 8 years later in a way no one could predict. James lived in Riverton, a place known for its tree-lined blocks and rows of brick buildings. From decades past, most folks in town worked at the local parts plant or in nearby shops, and the entire area had a friendly, almost everybody knows everybody atmosphere. James was around 40, employed as a machine operator at a manufacturing facility that produced automotive components, shipped all over the country. He rented a modest one-bedroom apartment on Washington Street, safe enough by day, but it turned lonely and unsettling after sundown. Despite his humble lifestyle, James was known to be kind and conscientious. He woke up at dawn, hopped on the bus to the plant, and returned home in the evenings for a simple dinner, perhaps, followed by a late-night talk show. On this particular evening, though, his shift stretched longer than usual due to a broken piece of machinery, and it was well after midnight when he finally clocked out. By then, Riverton was asleep, with just a few streetlights throwing faint circles on the sidewalks. A thin fog drifted between buildings, and the distant sound of freeway traffic played at the edges of hearing. Instead of waiting for his usual stop, James hopped off the bus early, wanting to cut through a deserted alley behind an old convenience store that had been boarded up for months. As he passed walls scrawled with peeling graffiti and stepped over cracks in the pavement, he heard the faint, distressed cry of a baby. It was so quiet he almost dismissed it as imagination, but the sound persisted, growing more distinct as he ventured deeper into the shadows. Then, next to a row of overflowing dumpsters, he noticed a small stroller. Approaching cautiously, heart pounding, he peered inside. To his shock, there was a tiny infant, swaddled in a blanket too thin to ward off the chilly night air. The baby's face was ashen, lips quivering from cold and hunger, and for a few seconds, James was frozen, in disbelief that someone could leave a child in such a state. His instincts kicked in, and he pulled out his phone to dial 911. His voice trembled as he gave details to the dispatcher, who assured him that help was on the way. In a matter of minutes, an ambulance arrived, accompanied by a patrol car. The paramedics examined the infant, noting signs of severe cold exposure and possible malnourishment. Meanwhile, an officer pulled James aside for a statement, asking him how he'd stumbled upon the baby and whether he'd noticed anyone else around. James answered every question truthfully, although his mind was still spinning. Nobody was in sight. No sound except the distant hum of the city's nightlife. The officers said they would investigate, looking for security camera footage and questioning nearby residents. Then they prepared to transport the baby to Riverton County Hospital for urgent care. While they were busy, James found himself unable to let go of the moment. He felt a strange connection to the infant, whose life was hanging by a thread. One of the officers mentioned that Child Protective Services would be notified, and if no relatives came forward, the baby might end up in foster care. Without fully understanding why, James gave them his contact information, insisting he wanted to know where the child would be placed. The officer raised an eyebrow but took down the details, advising James to follow up with Child Protective Services if he was really concerned. Soon, the ambulance pulled away, sirens fading into the night, and the alley fell silent. The battered stroller remained behind, a haunting testament to what had just happened. James lingered for a moment, staring at the place where the baby had been. The stark cruelty of abandoning a tiny human in the dark cut him to the core. Finally, he forced himself to walk home. His apartment felt especially empty when he arrived. He couldn't sleep, replaying the scene over and over, the baby's frail form, the urgent scramble of paramedics, the look of mild disbelief on the officer's face. Though James had weathered hardships in his life before, this event unsettled him in a profound way. The vulnerability he'd witnessed triggered feelings of empathy and responsibility he couldn't quite explain. Before dawn, James made up his mind to track the baby's status. He phoned the hospital and discovered the child had arrived severely hypothermic but was responding to treatment social workers had taken An interest, planning to secure temporary custody once doctors confirmed the baby's health. James felt a swirl of relief, sadness, and confusion. He'd never anticipated playing a role in something so momentous, yet a new sense of purpose tugged at him. A part of him couldn't shake the question, who would abandon their own baby like that? At the same time, he recognized that moral outrage wouldn't help this child. If there was even a remote chance he could make a difference, could he just walk away? Sleep proved impossible that morning. As James stared at the first rays of sunlight creeping through his thin curtains, wondering if fate had chosen him for a reason. In the days following James's discovery of the abandoned infant, he found it nearly impossible to concentrate on his normal routine. While he showed up on time at the factory and performed his tasks diligently, his thoughts stayed fixed on the baby, nicknamed Lucas, who remained under care at Riverton County Hospital. Police had uncovered no new clues, and the vague security footage showed only a hooded figure pushing a stroller before disappearing into the darkness. Growing restless, James visited the local Child Protective Services (CPS) office. A caseworker named Diana met him in a cramped cubicle, where he recounted the night he found Lucas. She explained that, barring any appearance by the child's relatives, foster placement was imminent. The idea of Lucas drifting through the system tugged at James's conscience, reminding him of the baby's desperate whimper in that cold alley. Summoning nerve, he inquired about possibly caring for Lucas himself. Though Diana was candid about the rigorous vetting process, background checks, financial reviews, home inspections, and mandatory parenting classes, she didn't outright dismiss him. That small encouragement stoked James's determination, even though he was single, lived in a modest apartment, and had minimal savings. Word of his plans spread around the factory. Some lauded him as a hero for wanting to help a defenseless child, while others urged caution, citing the relentless demands of infant care. Still, James pressed on. A few days later, Diana arranged a supervised hospital visit. Stepping into the pediatric ward, James felt a surge of protectiveness the moment he saw Lucas. Sleeping in a bassinet, tiny fists curled by his cheeks, monitors tracking his progress. A nurse mentioned he was responding well to treatment but needed careful observation to ensure healthy growth. After that encounter, James began working through the first wave of paperwork. He submitted details of his monthly income, references from his landlord and coworkers, and a basic overview of his living situation. The police investigation remained stalled, leaving a cloud of mystery around the mother's identity. Each time James fretted over who she was, or why she had abandoned her child, he reminded himself to focus on what he could actually do. Offer Lucas a chance at stability. Soon, Diana inspected his small apartment. She checked the locks on the windows and doors, noted the square footage, and asked about James's plans for childcare while he worked. His schedule at the factory was fairly rigid, and he had no close family nearby. But he believed he could juggle shifts and possibly find a daycare if CPS approved him. Diana noted everything quietly, giving no clear hint of approval or rejection. At night, James buried himself in library books on infant care, learning about feeding schedules, immunizations, and the emotional needs of a growing baby. He scribbled out a bare-bones budget, astonished by how costs could add up: diapers, formula, doctor visits, potential babysitters. Whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, he recalled the baby's shuddering cries by the dumpsters. That image fueled a resolve he never knew he had. Periodically, James dropped by the hospital, cherishing each moment with the slowly recovering infant. He would watch Lucas stir, yawn, and clench his tiny fingers around James's thumb. A simple gesture that left James unexpectedly emotional. A bond was forming, fragile yet undeniable. And the thought of CPS denying him weighed heavily on his heart. Late one evening, James sat at his kitchen table, the overhead light flickering slightly. His hands trembled as he signed the last of the preliminary documents Diana had provided. Outside, he could hear the distant rush of traffic, a reminder that life went on, regardless of his choices. Yet he had never felt so certain of his path. Whether or not the system saw him as suitable, he owed it to Lucas to try. He slid the papers into a folder, exhaling slowly. A surge of mixed feelings enveloped him: fear, hope, and a fierce determination he'd never experienced. Though the journey ahead promised to be steep, James sensed that by stepping forward, he had already changed his own life in ways he couldn't fully understand. And if he succeeded, perhaps he'd also rewrite the future of a child who so desperately deserved a second chance. Before turning in for the night, he carefully double-checked each form for errors, fully aware that any misstep could delay or derail his efforts. He reflected on the warnings he'd received from friends and colleagues, recalling every concern about financial strain, lack of sleep, and the emotional toll. Yet despite the magnitude of what he was undertaking, James felt a growing conviction that he was on the right path. In the stillness of his apartment, he whispered a silent promise to himself, to Lucas, and to whatever powers might be guiding him, that he would see this through, no matter how intimidating the hurdles became. Somehow, he believed that conviction could outweigh his fears, pushing him to do whatever it took to give Lucas the kind of life the child so desperately deserved. As James edged closer to a Child Protective Services decision, his life gained a new intensity. He clocked in at the factory each morning, but his evenings were spent on phone calls and paperwork, and on turning his modest apartment into a place fit for an infant. He visited thrift shops for a crib, bedding, and baby clothes, using what little savings he had. Co-workers offered bits of support, some donating leftover baby items or sharing advice. Despite his devotion, James feared CPS might reject him. He had no spouse, limited finances, and no family nearby. But every doubt melted away when he remembered finding Lucas in that dark alley, shivering beneath a thin blanket. That memory fueled his resolve each time uncertainty loomed. Soon, CPS conducted a detailed home inspection. Diana and another caseworker arrived, with lengthy checklists examining every corner of James's apartment. They asked how he planned to handle childcare while working and whether he realized how difficult single parenthood could be. James answered as best he could, anxious for their approval. They left without revealing a final verdict, leaving him to endure more restless nights. During supervised hospital visits, James witnessed Lucas's steady improvement. The infant was gaining weight, and those wide, trusting eyes stirred a powerful protective urge within James. Finally, a letter arrived confirming he had passed the initial CPS review. He called Diana, who explained the next steps, court paperwork, and parenting classes. If all went well, he might bring Lucas home soon. Energized, James threw himself into final preparations. A crib now stood in his bedroom, and second-hand baby clothes filled a small dresser. He arranged some unpaid leave at work and visited a daycare to gather information for the future. When the call came confirming he could pick Lucas up by the end of the week, James could hardly believe it. Walking into the hospital to take Lucas home felt surreal. Nurses ran through feeding guidelines and safety tips, handing James extra blankets and formula samples. Lucas wore a tiny blue onesie, blinking at the overhead lights, holding him for the first time as his legal guardian. James felt a flood of awe and responsibility. In the apartment, Lucas fussed at first, then settled in as James rocked him gently. The first few days were a blur of sleepless nights, frantic calls to the pediatrician, and countless diaper changes. James doubted himself constantly, worried that any mistake could jeopardize the fragile trust he was building. But gradually, he found a rhythm. He learned to soothe Lucas with gentle rocking, discovered how to measure formula precisely, and started recognizing the difference between cries for food and cries for comfort. Though tired beyond measure, James felt a sense of purpose he'd never known. CPS still considered his guardianship temporary, but regular check-ins would assess progress toward adoption. James welcomed this oversight, promising Diana he'd do whatever it took to ensure Lucas thrived. At night, gazing at the sleeping infant, James marveled at how radically his life had shifted. His once silent apartment now echoed with soft coos and the hum of a baby monitor. Though challenges lay ahead, financial strains, day-to-day uncertainties, he was certain he had made the right choice. Lucas had gone from an alley's edge to his safe crib, and James found a new sense of hope in offering a child the stability and warmth he himself had once longed for. Despite the steep learning curve, James noticed small victories each day. Lucas began to recognize his voice, turning his head when James entered the room. The fear that had initially overwhelmed James gradually eased, replaced by cautious confidence. As he developed a routine of feedings, naps, and quiet playtime on a soft blanket spread across the living room floor. Friends from work continued to show support. One neighbor, a retired teacher, knocked on James's door with a bag of hand-sewn baby blankets. Another dropped off a used rocking chair, insisting that every parent needed a comfortable spot to cradle their child at midnight. Though James's social circle was small, it felt as though the entire neighborhood was invested in Lucas's well-being. Meanwhile, James stayed in touch with CPS, filing regular progress reports. Diana occasionally dropped by unannounced to check that Lucas was healthy and that James hadn't been overwhelmed by the demands of single fatherhood. Each visit brought a hint of anxiety. James feared making a wrong impression, but Diana often laughed, with a reassuring nod, telling him he was doing well. Looking back on how far they had both come in such a brief time, James couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. He knew there would be more hurdles on the path to full adoption, yet every step reminded him that the decision to take Lucas home was the most meaningful choice he had ever made. 8 years passed in what felt like a blink. Lucas grew from a frail infant into a lively, inquisitive boy with a beaming smile. James, once unsure of his abilities, was now a devoted father, attending school events, helping with homework, and savoring weekend trips to the park. Money remained tight, but he made do by taking extra shifts at the factory whenever possible. Their cozy apartment bore signs of a child's presence, posters on the walls, toy cars under the couch, and a bookshelf lined with kids' stories. Officially, James had finalized Lucas's adoption years prior, and it was a day they both remembered vividly. Lucas had clung to James's hand in the courthouse, beaming at the judge. When the decree was announced, life felt stable until, around Lucas's 8th birthday, odd occurrences unsettled their routine. First, James noticed a woman lingering across the street at school pickup. She watched the children, her gaze lingering on Lucas. Another time, Lucas mentioned that a strange lady had asked his name and age. James's stomach churned with apprehension. Not long after, silent calls began interrupting their evenings. The phone would ring, only for the caller to hang up as soon as James answered. A neighbor reported seeing a distressed-looking woman in the hallway, asking if a man lived there with a young boy. Each new detail ratcheted up James's unease. One weekend morning, Lucas spotted a hooded figure staring into the diner where they were eating. When the woman realized she'd been seen, she hurried away. Could this be Lucas's birth mother resurfacing after all these years? James had no proof, but the timing and intense interest seemed impossible to ignore. He contacted the police, who took a report but said they lacked grounds to act without a threat. They advised him to keep notes in case the behavior escalated. Lucas, sensing the tension, worried someone wanted to take him away. James reassured him that no one could break the bond they shared. Still, at night, James lay awake, wrestling with fear and anger. He wondered if the woman had a right to see Lucas, or if she was merely a threat to everything he had built. The calls continued sporadically, sometimes with faint breathing on the line. Lucas attempted to shrug it off, but he grew jumpy whenever the phone rang. James considered changing their number, yet part of him wanted answers. Was this truly Lucas's biological mother, too guilt-ridden or afraid to come forward? He had always told Lucas that his birth mother might have had reasons beyond their understanding. Yet if it was her, why now? The uncertainty weighed on them both, slicing through the peace they'd cultivated. James tried to focus on everyday life, helping Lucas study for spelling tests, cooking simple dinners, and fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom. But a sense of foreboding lingered in the back of his mind. He reminded himself daily that he and Lucas had forged a bond no one could easily break. Still, the haunting question remained. Would the past somehow unravel their future? As the weeks went by, James noticed his own behavior shifting. He found himself scanning the crowd at Lucas's soccer practice or checking the streets whenever they left the apartment. He even started driving to the factory some days instead of taking the bus, preferring to keep Lucas by his side rather than risk a random encounter on foot. Though none of these measures felt entirely rational, he was determined to protect the home life they had built together. Lucas, for his part, tried to pretend everything was normal. He immersed himself in school projects and playdates with friends, but James could tell the silent calls and the mysterious sightings had left their mark. Late at night, James sometimes heard his son stirring in the next room, as if unsettled by vague nightmares. In moments of quiet reflection, James recalled the months of red tape, sleepless nights, and emotional upheaval that went into rescuing Lucas from a fate of abandonment. He had assumed those trials were behind them, sealed by legal documents and years of steady, nurturing love. Now, faced with this ghost from the past, he felt his old anxieties reviving. Still, he clung to the conviction that no one could dismantle the bond he and Lucas shared. He considered whether, if the mysterious woman truly was Lucas's birth mother, she might simply want to know her child was safe. Part of him, albeit small, empathized with a mother who might have acted out of desperation all those years ago. But another part boiled with anger at the idea that she might intrude on the stable life he had provided. With every ring of the phone, every unfamiliar face in the neighborhood, James braced himself for a confrontation. Yet the days and nights slipped by, with no direct contact. The tension hung in the air, a silent reminder that their peace was more fragile than he ever realized. As the eerie phone calls and fleeting glimpses of the hooded woman continued, James felt he was teetering on the edge of a long-hidden truth. Every day, he dreaded what might happen if the mysterious figure finally made contact. At the same time, a small part of him longed for closure, some resolution to the questions that had haunted him since the night he first found Lucas. The tension grew thicker with each passing week, until finally, events reached a point of no return. It happened on a brisk Saturday afternoon. Lucas had just finished soccer practice, and James stood by the sidelines, chatting with another parent, when he noticed a woman in a worn jacket lingering near the chain-link fence. She was staring at Lucas, who was happily kicking a ball with a couple of teammates. This time, instead of fleeing when spotted, she took a halting step forward. James tensed, his pulse hammering in his ears. The other parent, sensing his discomfort, quietly excused herself. The woman approached, shoulders hunched, eyes darting as if she feared someone might stop her at any second. Up close, James could see lines of worry etched into her face. Her hair was unkempt, and her lips quivered with nerves. Despite his anger and apprehension, a surge of compassion flickered in James's chest. Something about her posture, so defeated, so desperate, suggested she posed no immediate threat. "Mr. Williams," she began in a shaky whisper, I'm sorry for all of this. I didn't know how else to." James cut her off, his voice low. "Who are you? Why are you following my son?" She faltered, tears welling in her eyes. My name is Andrea," she said, pausing, as if each word weighed a ton. "I'm Lucas's. I'm the one who..." A wave of emotions engulfed James: anger, disbelief, pity, and a deep-seated protective instinct for Lucas. "You left him," he said harshly, trying to keep his voice down so the boys wouldn't hear. "You left him in an alley. Why come back now?" Andrea swallowed hard, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I was scared. Young. My life was a mess. I had no money, no place to go. I convinced myself that if someone else found him, he'd get a better chance. Then I couldn't bring myself to come forward. I was afraid of being arrested. Afraid Lucas would hate me for what I did." James's chest tightened, hearing her speak so plainly about the one event that had defined his life. For 8 years felt surreal. He glanced at Lucas, who was still engrossed in the game, oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few yards away. Even now, James wished he could shield his son from the heartbreak that this conversation threatened to unleash. But the moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no way to stop it. "Why the phone calls? The stalking? You terrified both of us," he said, forcing himself to keep his tone measured. Andrea twisted her hands together, looking ashamed. "I didn't know how to reach out. I figured you wouldn't talk to me if I just knocked on your door, and I wanted to see him. To know he was all right before I made contact. But every time I tried, I lost my nerve. I'm sorry." James exhaled shakily. The stadium lights buzzed overhead, and the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the field. "Lucas is doing fine," he said at last, resisting the urge to lash out. "He's healthy, he's happy, and he doesn't need to be dragged into whatever guilt you're feeling." Andrea nodded, tears still glistening. "I'm not here to take him away," she whispered. "I don't have any legal right, nor do I want to destroy what you two have. But I had to see him, just once, outside of pictures and rumors. I needed to make sure he was living the life I couldn't give him." James studied her, trying to discern if she was telling the truth. Despite his fury, he sensed genuine remorse in her trembling voice. "You can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "He's my son. Legally. Morally. If you care about him at all, you have to stop lurking around. It's not fair to Lucas." "I know," Andrea said, lowering her gaze. "But could I just talk to him one time? Please, I need to apologize. Properly." James stiffened. He pictured Lucas's wide-eyed confusion if confronted by the woman who had abandoned him. The potential for emotional harm was massive, and James wasn't sure if a single apology would fix anything. Yet, another part of him wondered if denying Lucas this chance at truth might haunt the boy later. He had always told Lucas that people deserved Second chances, was this a moment to prove he believed it? Not here. Not now. James finally said, casting a glance at Lucas in the distance. I need to talk to him first. And I'm not promising anything. But I can't just spring you on him like this. Andrea closed her eyes, relief washing over her features. Thank you, she whispered. I'll wait for your call. If you need time to decide, I understand. She scribbled a number on a crumpled slip of paper and pressed it into James's hand. Then, with one last yearning look toward Lucas, she turned and retreated, disappearing beyond the fence. That evening, James wrestled with whether to tell Lucas what had happened. After dinner, as Lucas watched cartoons, James sat at the kitchen table, turning the slip of paper over and over in his hand. He ultimately resolved that honesty was best, especially given the suspicious phone calls and sightings that had already rattled them both. So, when Lucas switched off the TV and wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water, James gently asked him to sit. There's something important we need to talk about, he began, heart pounding. Then, as calmly as possible, he explained that the woman from the diner and the phone calls claimed to be Lucas's birth mother. He chose his words carefully, highlighting that she seemed remorseful, but not shying away from the fact that she had once made the choice to abandon him. Lucas's eyes went wide with fear, then confusion, and finally curiosity. What does she want? He asked quietly, clutching the edge of the table as if bracing himself. James swallowed hard, remembering Andrea's desperate expression. She says she just wants to apologize. She says she doesn't want to take you away. For a moment, Lucas stared at his father, emotions churning. Are you mad at her? James hesitated, then nodded honestly. Yes, part of me is. But I also know we can't ignore the fact that she exists, that she's been looking for you, whether we choose to see her or not. This is your life, your story. Lucas fiddled with a loose thread on his sleeve. I want to meet her, he said, voice trembling. Not because I don't love you, I do, but I have questions. A wave of relief and dread swept over James. Okay, he said quietly. But we'll do it with boundaries. We'll meet in a public place, and I'll be right by your side. Lucas nodded. Thanks, Dad. They agreed on a quiet cafe downtown for the meeting. The day arrived with gray skies overhead, adding to the somber tension. James and Lucas walked in to find Andrea already seated at a corner table, eyes red from what looked like recent tears. She stood as they approached, but James held up a hand, indicating that any hug or physical contact would need to be Lucas's choice. Lucas took a seat across from her, his small hands folded in his lap. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Andrea cleared her throat. Hi, she whispered, mustering a weak smile. I'm so glad you came. Lucas gazed at her, his face a mixture of nerves and guarded curiosity. You're my mother? He asked, voice wavering. Andrea's eyes brimmed again. Yes, she said. I know I don't have the right to call myself that after what I did, but I'm the one who gave birth to you. She inhaled shakily, then began her halting explanation. She spoke of poverty, an abusive relationship, fear of homelessness. She admitted she felt Lucas would have a better chance if someone else took him in, a chance she couldn't provide. Then she recounted years of guilt, of trying to find out whether he was safe, and finally mustering the courage to approach James. Throughout her confession, Lucas's emotions flickered: sympathy, confusion, anger, and something like pity. He glanced once or twice at James, who reached for his son's shoulder, offering silent comfort. When Andrea finished, she wiped her cheeks, unable to meet Lucas's eyes. I'm sorry, she said, voice quivering. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to keep you. I'm sorry I've caused you pain now. Lucas stared down at his clasped hands. I'm okay, he said at last, though the tremor in his voice betrayed a swirl of feelings. Dad, James, saved me. He's the one who takes care of me. And I love him. Andrea nodded, tears falling freely now. He's your real parent, she said. I see that. James watched his son struggle to gather his thoughts. Finally, Lucas looked up, eyes shimmering with emotion. I don't hate you, he said softly, but it really hurt, knowing someone left me like that. Andrea sniffled, nodding again. I understand. I wanted you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. I wanted to come sooner, but I was so ashamed. With that, silence settled over the table. The hum of the espresso machine buzzed in the background, and a few customers drifted in, oblivious to the emotional gravity of the moment. James felt his heartache for Lucas, but he also felt an odd sense of resolution. Perhaps this was the closure they all needed, no matter how painful. Lucas blinked back tears. "I have a family now," he said, glancing at James. "I'm safe. I'm happy. But maybe we can talk sometimes? If Dad says it's okay." James gave his son's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "We can figure that out," he said, carefully, eyeing Andrea. "Boundaries, respect, and honesty, that's non-negotiable." Andrea exhaled, relief mixing with heartbreak. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered. "I'm not asking to replace anyone. I just want to know you in whatever way you'll allow." They spoke a bit longer, though no one pretended the conversation erased years of regret and confusion. When it was time to leave, Andrea rose, gave Lucas a tentative nod, and thanked James for his understanding. Outside, the clouds parted slightly, letting a shaft of light pierce the dull gray sky. James and Lucas walked home slowly, each lost in thought. It was the end of one story, and the beginning of another. The mother's sudden appearance had been terrifying, and it had resurrected buried fears. Yet in confronting her, father and son had reaffirmed the bond that had formed in a lonely alley 8 years before. Though the past could never be changed, its power to wound was finally diminished by honesty, compassion, and the promise of a gentler future. That night, as Lucas fell asleep, James tucked him in and softly closed the bedroom door. He stood in the dim hallway, heart heavy but hopeful. The phone might still ring. The past might still cast shadows, but he believed they could weather it all together. Whatever happened next, he and Lucas had faced the most haunting question of their lives and emerged stronger. And in that quiet moment, James felt certain that no twist of fate could ever break the family they had become.